Her fingerprints were on documents she'd never touched. Her name was already trending as corporate thief before security finished walking her to the elevator. And in exactly 6 hours, she would make one phone call that would turn Seoul's business district into a graveyard of reputations. Justice shouldn't need a mafia husband to work. But for Chiang, tonight, it did. If you believe hardworking women deserve better than forged signatures and cowardly boardrooms, hit subscribe and drop a like. Only the Han Suk-woos of the world, the cowards who sacrifice the innocent to save their own skin, won't. Ching Okafor had rehearsed her expansion pitch so many times she could recite it underwater. Slide 14 was her favorite, the one where projected revenue curved upward like a smile, like proof that Nairobi girls with scholarship letters and stubborn mothers could build empires out of spreadsheets. She'd worn her navy blazer, the one with the sleeve she'd hemmed herself at 2 a.m. because she refused to pay alterations fees on a director's salary when she had 2 working hands. She never got past slide 2. The boardroom door opened without a knock, which in corporate Seoul is the equivalent of a gunshot. 2 security guards walked in like they were retrieving contraband instead of a human being. Behind them, HR Director Park Yoon-hee held a folder she wouldn't make eye contact over. "Miss Okafor," Yoon-hee said, voice pitched for an audience. "We need you to come with us." "I'm mid-presentation," Ching said it like a woman who still believed logic could save her. She would remember later how naive that sentence sounded. The CEO, Han Suk-woo, a man who had personally recruited her, who'd once toasted her at a company dinner and called her the best decision this company ever made, wouldn't look up from the folder in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the practiced grief of a man reading someone else's script. $11 million, he said. "Routed through 3 shell accounts. Your fingerprints are on every authorization page." The room went silent in that particular way. Rooms go silent when everyone has already decided you're guilty and is simply waiting to see if you'll cry or fight. Ching did neither. She asked calmly to see the documents. They showed her a signature that was hers and wasn't. Too clean, too certain, like a forgery drawn by someone who'd studied her handwriting the way art thieves study brushstrokes. "I didn't do this," she said. Nobody in that room believed her. Not because the evidence was good, though it was disturbingly good, but because belief is a luxury companies extend to people who look like they belong. Ching had spent 5 years proving she belonged, and it had taken these people 4 minutes to decide she never had. They walked her out through the main lobby, not the service exit. The main lobby, past the glass wall where every junior associate who'd once asked her for career advice now studied their phones like they contained the secrets of the universe. A photographer, someone had called a photographer, caught her face as the revolving door spat her onto the sidewalk. By the time she reached the corner, the photo was already captioned, "Hanshin Tech Director escorted out amid embezzlement scandal." She sat on a bench in the small park across from the building she'd helped build into a billion-dollar name, and she let herself do the one thing she'd promised herself she'd never do at work. She cried, quietly, efficiently. Like even her grief had deadlines. Her phone buzzed. A number she'd saved under a fake contact name, Wine Guy, because her assistant had assumed as much and she'd never corrected her. Kang Ji-hoon, her husband. The man she'd married in a ceremony so small and secret that even the officiant thought it was a rehearsal. She almost didn't answer. 2 years of marriage, and she had never once used him as a weapon. That had been the deal. The one she'd negotiated over soup in a place with no cameras, back when he'd finally admitted that investor was a generous word for what he actually was. "I build my career with my own hands, or this doesn't work," he'd agreed. He'd kept his empire in a separate room of their life, like a coat closet neither of them opened in front of guests. But her hands, tonight, had nothing left to build with, she answered. Ching. His voice was low, already alert, already aware something was wrong before she'd said a word. The way men who run empires learn to hear catastrophe in a single syllable. She looked up at the building. Her building, once. The lights were still on in the boardroom where they'd humiliated her, executives probably still congratulating themselves on decisive action. "Buy the company," she whispered, and something in her chest cracked open, 2 years of careful separation collapsing in a single sentence. "Buy it, Ji-hoon, and ruin everyone who did this to me." There was a silence on the line, not hesitation she'd learn later, but calculation. Then, "Send me everything, every name in that room." He didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't ask if this crossed a line they'd drawn together in gentler days. He simply said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes," and hung up, And somewhere in Seoul, a phone call was already being made that would end careers before sunrise. Aching wiped her face, stood up, and for the first time all day, smiled. It wasn't relief. It was something closer to a warning. Ji-hoon arrived without bodyguards, which unsettled Aching more than an army would have. He came through the park in a plain gray coat, hands in his pockets, looking like any other tired businessman walking home. Except tired businessmen don't make 3 Seoul conglomerates worth of security directors reach for their phones the second they're spotted on a traffic camera. He didn't hug her first. He looked at her face, checked it the way a man checks a door for damage before checking what's behind it, and only then pulled her in. "Tell me everything," he said, from the first slide. She told him. The forged signatures, the shell accounts, the way Han Suk-woo wouldn't meet her eyes like guilt was contagious and he didn't want to catch what he was giving her. Ji-hoon listened without interrupting, which was somehow worse than if he'd raged. His stillness had a temperature to it, like the air right before Seoul's summer storms. 11 million, he repeated. That's an amateur's number. Big enough to end a career. Small enough nobody at the top loses sleep reporting it to the board. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way he always did, the way that used to comfort her when it was applied to hotel reservations and dinner plans and now made her stomach tighten, because she knew exactly what kind of chess this was. "I don't want blood," she said. "I want the truth. I want my name back." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Ji-hoon said, "but they're not the same thing either. Which do you want first?" She hadn't expected the question to cut that deep. Which do you want first? As if vengeance were a menu and she got to order in any sequence she liked. She thought of Yoonhee's folder, of the photographer who'd been called ahead of time, of Suk-woo's rehearsed grief. "The truth," she said finally. "Get me the truth. You can have whatever's left." He almost smiled. Almost. "That's my wife," he said, and it sounded less like affection and more like a verdict. By morning, the truth had started moving on its own. Anonymous holding companies, 3 of them, registered in jurisdictions with names Aching had only seen in tax documentaries, began quietly acquiring Hanshin tech stock. Not enough to trigger a single alarm. Enough, cumulatively, to make 3 separate compliance officers frown at their screens and decide it wasn't their problem yet. Auditors nobody at Hanshin had authorized began requesting 5 years of transaction records, citing routine oversight in language so bureaucratically boring that nobody thought to ask who'd sent them. Han Suk-woo, who had smiled for cameras less than 24 hours earlier while calling Aching a criminal, spent his morning fielding a call from a regulator whose name he didn't recognize, asking questions about a shell account he definitely recognized. By lunch, his assistant told him 3 board members wanted an informal chat before the emergency session Friday. Informal chats in corporate Korea are where careers go to die politely. Aching watched all of this from the guest room of Ji-hoon's penthouse, a room she'd stayed in exactly twice before, both times joking that it looked like nobody actually lived there, which, she now realized, was because nobody was supposed to know anyone did. She scrolled through the financial filings Ji-hoon's people had already pulled, and something nagged at her, small and sharp, like a splinter she couldn't locate. The forged documents were good. Too good. Whoever built them hadn't just copied her signature, they'd replicated the exact formatting quirks of internal memos only a handful of people had access to. Someone inside Hanshin had helped. She thought of Soo-min immediately, then hated herself for thinking it. Soo-min, who'd trained beside her for 4 years, who'd cried real tears. She was sure they were real, at the small disguised dinner that had passed as Aching's wedding celebration. Soo-min, who'd texted her that morning, "I'm so sorry, I don't believe any of it. Call me when you can." "Ji-hoon," she said, staring at the formatting quirks like they might rearrange themselves into an innocent explanation. "I think someone I trusted did this." He looked up from his own screen, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something in his composure shifted. Not surprise, she realized. Confirmation. "I know," he said quietly. "I found her name 4 hours ago. I was deciding how to tell you. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for betrayal by people who know exactly how you take your coffee." Aching had expected to feel rage when Ji-hoon said Soo-min's name. Instead, she felt something closer to vertigo, like the floor of every memory she owned had quietly been replaced with something load-bearing and false. "Show me," she said. Ji-hoon turned his laptop toward her. Internal memo templates, formatting macros, a login timestamp from a terminal registered to Soo-min's employee ID, active at 2:47 a.m., 3 days before the board meeting, generating draft versions of the very transfer documents that had ended Chiang's career. It wasn't circumstantial. It was a woman's fingerprints on a knife, if fingerprints could also cry at your wedding toast. There has to be an explanation, Chiang said, and hated how small her own voice sounded defending someone who'd apparently spent 3 sleepless nights building her downfall. There usually is, Ji-hoon said. That doesn't mean it's a good one. He was right, infuriatingly, within the hour. Ji-hoon's people didn't kick down doors. That was for men who mistook intimidation for intelligence. Instead, someone quietly reviewed Soo-min's father's medical records, his mounting hospital bills, and a series of threatening messages sent to Soo-min's personal phone from an untraceable number 3 weeks before the forgery began. Cooperate or the surgery never happens. Soo-min hadn't sold Chiang out for money. She'd been cornered into it, one sick father and one anonymous threat at a time, until betraying her closest friend became the only door left unlocked in a house on fire. Chiang insisted on seeing her in person. Ji-hoon didn't like it. She could tell by the specific way he didn't argue, which was somehow louder than if he had. But he arranged a meeting in a private room above a quiet restaurant, no cameras, no witnesses except the 2 of them and a pot of tea nobody touched. Soo-min looked like she hadn't slept since the forgery began, which Chiang now understood was probably true. When she saw Chiang, she didn't run and didn't perform innocence. She just started crying, the ugly, honest kind that doesn't care about appearances. They said they'd let him die on the waiting list, Soo-min said. They showed me his file. They showed me how easy it would be to just lose it in the system. I told myself I'd fix it after. I told myself you'd forgive me if you knew why. Who's they? Chiang asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. I don't know a name, Soo-min said. Just a voice. And an account number where I sent proof I'd finished once the documents were planted, came in registration. I have the wire details. I kept everything in case I needed to prove I didn't want to do it. Ji-hoon took the details without a word, already dialing someone before Soo-min finished the sentence. Here's the part Chiang wants you sitting with, the way she had to sit with it in that quiet room. It is easy to hate the woman who forged your signature. It is much harder, and much more necessary, to ask who forged the trap that forced her hand. Somebody built a system where a good daughter's only choices were her father's life or her best friend's career, and then that same somebody let the world call Soo-min a villain instead of a victim of a much colder architect. If you think people who get cornered into terrible choices deserve at least the chance to be heard before they're judged, hit that like button right now. And subscribe, because only people who enjoy watching the powerless get crushed for the sins of the powerful would scroll past this without one. The wire trail led exactly where Ji-hoon expected and exactly where Chiang didn't. Not to a rival executive hungry for Hanshin's market share, but to a private holding company with paperwork so clean it screamed of someone who'd learned money laundering from watching amateurs get caught. Ji-hoon stared at the ownership documents for a long moment, his jaw tightening in a way Chiang had seen exactly twice before. Both times right before something in his world violently rearranged itself. What? She asked. Whose account is it? He turned the screen toward her, and the name sitting quietly at the top of the shell company's registry wasn't a stranger's at all. It was family. Kang Tae-yang, Chiang read aloud, like saying the name slowly might make it less true. Your cousin. Ji-hoon didn't answer right away. He set the laptop down with the careful precision of a man handling something that might detonate if jostled wrong. My father's brother's son, he said finally. We grew up in the same house for 2 years after his father died. I forgot he existed most days. He never forgot I existed for a single one of his. Chiang had heard fragments of Ji-hoon's family history the way you hear weather from another country. Present, distant, not something she'd thought to ask more about. Because Ji-hoon guarded his past the way he guarded everything else, in a locked room she'd agreed not to knock on. Now the room was open, and what was inside it explained a great deal about why a man could build an empire and still flinch, almost imperceptibly, at one cousin's name. He wanted your seat, she said. It wasn't a question. He's wanted my seat since we were 14, Ji-hoon said. The council chose me over him 11 years ago. Tae-yang has spent every year since telling anyone who'll listen that the wrong man got the throne. I assumed it was pride talking. I didn't think he'd spend a decade actually building a case. This isn't pride, Chiang said, gesturing at the screen, at Soo-min's terrified face still fresh in her mind, at the $11 million and the forged signature and the photographer who'd been called ahead of time. This is a man who planned to destroy me to get to you. Ji-hoon's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, a recalibration. The look of a general realizing the battle he thought he was fighting was actually a smaller piece of a war he hadn't known had started. Not just to get to me, he said slowly. Think about it. Why frame you publicly? Why not just have me killed quietly, the way ambitious men usually solve succession problems? He wanted spectacle. He wanted the council to watch me unravel over a woman. He wanted them to see the untouchable king bleed in public, chasing a scandal instead of running his territory. So I wasn't the target, Achieng said. I was the bait. You were the trigger, Ji-hoon corrected quietly, and for the first time since the boardroom door had opened on the worst day of her life, Achieng saw something close to fear cross her husband's face. Not fear for himself, she realized. Fear of what he might become if this went the way Taeyang had designed it to go. That night, while Ji-hoon took calls in the other room, his voice dropping into a register she rarely heard, cold and final, the voice of the man his enemies were afraid of, Achieng sat with the ownership documents and let herself feel the full, dizzying scope of it. She hadn't been fired for a mistake. She hadn't even really been fired for who she was, though that particular cruelty had made it easier for everyone in that boardroom to believe the lie. She'd been fired because somewhere, a man she'd never met had decided her career was an acceptable casualty in a war for a throne she hadn't known existed. There is a specific fury that arrives not when you're wronged, but when you realize how small you were to the person who wronged you. Not an enemy, not even a real obstacle, just a convenient lever. Achieng felt that fury settle into her spine like iron. Ji-hoon came back into the room near midnight, and for once, he didn't try to hide the calculation happening behind his eyes. The council meets in 9 days, he said. Taeyang will use that meeting to make his move, publicly, in front of every family that matters. If I retaliate against him now, quietly, the way instinct is screaming at me to, I prove every word he's whispered about me for a decade. That I'm reckless. That I let a woman rule my judgment. That the throne makes men soft. And if you don't retaliate, then he wins anyway, because he'll have humiliated us both and walked away clean. Ji-hoon exhaled, and for a moment he looked less like the man who made regulators reschedule vacations, and more like a man standing at the edge of a decision that would define which husband and which king he actually was. I need something sharper than revenge, Achieng, and I don't think I'm the one who's going to find it. She looked at him for a long moment, feeling the shape of an idea begin to form. One that had nothing to do with holding companies or council meetings, and everything to do with the exact skill set that had made her the youngest operations director in Hanshin's history in the first place. No, she agreed slowly. I don't think you are either. Ji-hoon expected her to ask for men. Instead, Achieng asked for a laptop, 4 days, and a list of every subsidiary Taeyang shell company had touched in the last 3 years. You're not planning to shoot him, Ji-hoon said, half a question. I'm planning to audit him, she replied, and something in the set of her jaw told him this was not a lesser threat. Here was the truth Ji-hoon had never fully appreciated, even after 2 years of marriage. He had married a woman who dismantled billion-dollar logistics inefficiencies for breakfast, who read compliance filings the way other people read novels, who had clawed her way to the top of a hostile industry using nothing but precision and an unwillingness to be underestimated twice. He had an empire built on fear. She had a mind built on receipts. He was beginning to suspect hers was the more dangerous weapon. She set up in the penthouse's unused study, surrounded by printed shell company registries, wire transfer histories, and the detail that made Ji-hoon go very still when he saw it, the shelved files from the failed AI logistics project she'd buried at Hanshin 2 years earlier. The project nobody at the company had cared about. The project, it turned out, that a rival conglomerate wanted badly enough to destroy a woman's entire life just to get someone desperate enough to hand it over. It's not about me, Achieng said, connecting threads on a whiteboard with the calm intensity of a woman finally standing on ground she understood. It was never about me. Taeyang needed leverage inside Hanshin to access the shipping lane algorithm buried in my old project files. Framing me got me removed and got his investigators disguised as regulators, inside the building with legitimate-looking access. Destroying my reputation was efficient. It solved 2 problems with 1 forged signature. You're saying he's not just after the throne, Ji-hoon said slowly. He's after the project. I'm saying the throne and the project were always the same prize. Whoever controls that algorithm controls shipping contracts worth more than the council's entire portfolio combined. Taeyang wasn't planning to inherit your empire, Ji-hoon. He was planning to make his own, funded by something I built and forgot about. For the first time since the boardroom door had opened on the worst morning of her life, Chiang felt something shift from grief into strategy. Grief was reactive. Strategy had teeth. Over the next 4 days, she built a case the way she'd built every successful pitch of her career. Methodically, ruthlessly sourced, immune to emotional argument. She traced the shell company's ownership through 6 jurisdictions back to an account Tae-yang had been careless enough to touch personally exactly once, 3 years ago, before he'd learned better. She cross-referenced the regulators who'd requested Hanshin's audit records against a private security firm quietly owned by the same shell network. She found the wire that had paid for the photographer outside Hanshin's building, a detail so specific, so damning, that even Ji-hoon exhaled audibly when she showed him. "This isn't revenge," she told him, spreading the final case file across the table like a woman laying down a winning hand. "This is proof. Counsel admissible, court admissible, headline admissible proof. You don't need to destroy Tae-yang in some back alley and prove every rumor about your marriage right. You need to walk into that council meeting and let the truth do what violence never could. Humiliate him permanently in front of the only people whose opinion he's spent his whole life trying to win." Ji-hoon studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Pride, she'd learn later, tangled up with the grief of his own, the quiet mourning of a man realizing his cousin's betrayal was total and irreversible. "He's still going to come for us before the meeting," Ji-hoon said. "A man like Tae-yang doesn't wait quietly to be exposed. He'll want to force the confrontation before I can use what you've built." Chiang didn't flinch. She'd spent 5 years being underestimated in boardrooms. She wasn't about to start second-guessing herself in one that determined her actual life. "Then let him come," she said. "Last time, he attacked a woman he assumed had no leverage of her own. Let's see how that assumption survives contact with the truth." Outside, Seoul's skyline glittered indifferently, unaware that somewhere in a quiet penthouse study, the war for an empire had just changed hands from a man who understood fear to a woman who understood spreadsheets and was about to prove which one actually won wars. Tae-yang came on the 7th night, which meant Chiang's case file was finished but not yet delivered, the worst possible timing, and she suspected exactly the timing he'd planned for. He didn't storm the penthouse. Men like Tae-yang understood optics too well for that. He arrived alone, announced, dressed like a man attending a business dinner rather than a confrontation 2 decades in the making. Ji-hoon met him in the main room. Chiang stood at the edge of it, close enough to hear everything, far enough to let her husband handle the opening moves of a war she'd spent 4 days arming him for. "Cousin," Tae-yang said, smiling the particular smile of a man who believes he's already won, "I hear your operations director had quite the fall from grace. Terrible business, forged signatures. You should really vet your wife's competence before marrying her, though I suppose secrecy has its costs. You should really vet your shell companies before wiring money to a photographer," Ji-hoon said, and watched, with visible satisfaction, the smile falter for exactly 1 second before Tae-yang recovered it. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Ji-hoon said. "My wife doesn't imply, she documents." He nodded toward Chiang, and this was the moment. She'd rehearsed it in her head a dozen times on the flight of stairs between grief and this room, where she stepped forward and let the truth do the talking violence never could. "Came in registration, 3 jurisdictions deep, but sloppy at the source," she said, setting the file on the table between them like she was closing a business deal, because in every way that mattered, she was. "You touched the account personally once, 3 years ago. Amateur mistake for a man who's spent a decade planning to steal a throne. I also have the wire that paid the photographer outside Hanshin's building the morning I was walked out. Same network, same laundering pattern, same carelessness. And I have Sumin's testimony, corroborated by medical records, showing exactly how you coerced her into planting the forgery. You didn't destroy me, Tae-yang. You just handed me a paper trail with your name written all over it." For a moment, something genuine flickered across Tae-yang's face. Not fear exactly, but the specific disorientation of a man realizing the woman he'd treated as collateral damage had turned out to be the architect of his downfall. "You think the council will care about a forged document scandal?" he said, recovering, sneering now. "They care about strength, about who's willing to act. Ji-hoon hides behind boardrooms and paperwork. I was willing to burn a woman's career to prove a point. That's the difference between a king and a caretaker." "The difference," Chiang said quietly, "is that you needed to destroy an innocent woman to make your point, and I only needed a laptop to unmake yours." Ji-hoon stepped closer, and here was the moment Chiang had genuinely worried about. The moment where 2 years of buried rage over a childhood spent under the same roof as this man might finally break loose, where the Mafia king everyone expected might simply choose violence because violence was faster and felt, in the moment, more satisfying than patience. She watched him weigh it. She watched him choose. "I could kill you tonight," Ji-hoon said, voice flat, almost gentle, which made it worse. "Nobody would ask questions. That's the power you've spent your whole life resenting me for having. But you want to know the real difference between us, Taeyang? You needed to destroy someone to prove you deserved power. I don't need to destroy you at all. I just need to let the council see exactly what you are, in the daylight, with proof they can't dismiss as family jealousy. That's not weakness. That's the throne you'll never sit on because you never understood the difference." Taeyang's composure cracked fully then, the mask sliding to reveal something raw and furious underneath. A man who'd spent a decade building toward a moment of triumph, watching it collapse in real time in front of the cousin he'd never stopped envying. "The council meets in 2 days, Ji-hoon said. You'll be there. So will this file. Choose how you want to walk in, as a man who lost fairly, or a man who ran and confirmed every word of it." Taeyang left without another word, and Chiang, watching the door close behind him, felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who has just watched her husband choose to be better than the world expected, and understood for the first time that the throne had never been the real prize either of them was fighting for. The council chamber held 12 seats and 2 centuries of unspoken rules, and Chiang was not supposed to be in it. Wives didn't attend, outsiders didn't attend, Black women who'd been publicly branded corporate criminals 4 weeks earlier especially didn't attend. Ji-hoon walked her in anyway, past the visible discomfort of men who'd built entire philosophies around never having to share a room with a consequence they hadn't approved in advance. Taeyang was already seated, composed again, having spent 2 days rebuilding the version of himself that photographed well. He rose when Ji-hoon entered, offering the kind of smile that had fooled a council for a decade. "Cousin," he said, "and guest, I didn't realize this was a family matter now." "It was always a family matter," Ji-hoon said. "You just made the mistake of thinking family meant only the people who share your blood, instead of the people who share your table." Chiang didn't wait for permission. She'd spent 5 years earning the right to speak in rooms that didn't want her, and she wasn't about to lose the habit now. She placed the file on the central table, the same file, the wire trail, the shell registrations, Soo-min's sworn testimony, the photographer's invoice, and let 12 powerful men read, in silence, exactly how one of their own had manufactured a public scandal to steal an algorithm and a throne in the same motion. "Kang Tae-yang orchestrated the destruction of my career to gain unauthorized access to Hanshin Tech's shipping lane logistics platform," she said, voice steady. The voice she used to close billion-dollar pitches, not the voice she'd used crying on a park bench a month ago. "He coerced an employee using threats against her dying father. He paid for a photographer to ensure my humiliation was public and permanent. He did this not to weaken Hanshin Tech, but to weaken Ji-hoon, believing this council would blame a wife's scandal for a king's judgment, instead of recognizing a coward's plot for exactly what it was." The chairman, an old man named Choi, who had outlived 3 rivals and buried his own ambitions decades ago, studied the documents for a long, silent minute. "This is thorough," he said finally, and there was something almost like respect in it. "More thorough than anything this council has produced internally in years." "She used to run operations for a billion-dollar tech company," Ji-hoon said, "before your nephew decided her competence was inconvenient to his ambitions." Taeyang tried, one last time, to reframe it. Strength, decisiveness, the tired language of men who mistake cruelty for leadership, but the room had already turned. 12 men who valued power above almost everything did not, it turned out, value being made fools of by amateur laundering mistakes. By the time the vote came, it wasn't close. Taeyang was stripped of standing, assets frozen pending formal review, exiled from a council he'd spent a lifetime trying to inherit. He didn't go quietly, he never would. But Chiang watched him leave that chamber understanding something she hadn't fully believed until that moment. The truth, precisely aimed, cuts deeper than any blade Ji-hoon could have used, and it left her hands clean. Hanshin Tech's board, facing regulators Ji-hoon's holdings had quietly summoned weeks earlier, issued a public retraction within days. Han Suk-woo resigned before the ink dried. Soo-min, cleared and reinstated, sent Chiang a single message: "Thank you for still calling me family." Chiang was reinstated too, though she declined the title, having discovered, in the space of 1 brutal month, that she no longer needed Hanshin's name to know her own worth. That evening, back on the same park bench where she'd once made the phone call that started a quiet war, Jihoon found her watching the same skyline, transformed now from a symbol of everything she'd lost into proof of everything she'd rebuilt. "Regret it?" he asked. "Any of it?" "I regret that it took losing everything to remember I never needed anyone's permission to be brilliant," she said. "I don't regret marrying a man who let me fight my own war and just made sure I had a fair fight." Jihoon sat beside her, no bodyguards, no empire between them, just a husband and the wife who taught the most feared man in Seoul that real power was knowing when to put the knife down and hand someone a spreadsheet instead. "So," he said, "what do you build next?" Aching smiled, and for the first time since a boardroom door had opened on the worst morning of her life, it wasn't a warning, it was a beginning.